few counties, but I think we're probably gonna want to talk about these ones a bit more with people in attendance. So for Washington County, I'm gonna pass it off for Huda to talk about the changes in the estimates between 2022 and 2023.
So again, the population growth here is because of net migration, same as the previous two counties. And also what we did for the previous two counties, Clackamas County and Columbia County, we did for the Washington County. We went back and updated or revised the population estimates that we produced in the previous year. So now we have the new set from the 23 cycle. As we mentioned before, also here we notice a drop in the population between 20 and 21 during the COVID time because of the negative of net migration, and then the population increased again between 21 and 22, and again between 22 and 23. All during the last or the past 4 years, there's an increase between 20 census from 600K to 610K as of July 1st, 23 in the Washington County.
Looking to the forecast period, so Washington County is a outlier in terms of population growth for our current set of forecasts, but like all of our forecasts, we downwardly adjusted that a bit to talk about for declining fertility rates, and is the biggest changing that we're seeing here, you know, and a lot of those long-term benefits for like Washington population were because Washington is relatively young compared to other locations. And with this dropping of the fertility rates and a expectation of having less kids moving forward, you know, we're going to see this big change in the long-term population being the biggest contributor that's happening over here, right? So Washington is one of the few counties where in 2020 and 2021, we didn't see deaths outpacing births. So even though COVID increased the number of deaths that we observed in the county, births still wildly outpaced it. And, you know, in most of the forecasts that we have for most counties, we have deaths outpacing births in some period out to 2054. That is not the case for Washington. We still expect the number of births here to outpace deaths. And the factor here is that we expect that because of the young age population that we have for the county. The number of migrants, you know, has dropped off since the early 90s, where we saw a lot of people coming into the county, and we expect that to bounce back a little bit, but not as much as as what we saw in that early 90s period. So this is one where we did adjust it for the migration as well. This is one where we also consulted with Metro a lot. Washington makes up a large portion of the MSA region. So this is where we really wanted to make sure that we had alignment in terms of both net migration and births as well. And so this is a big contributing factor in terms of two is like, are we seeing this at the MSA level? Because we know it's happening at the MSA level is also happening within Washington as well, as Impact Washington is a part of that. Right, so we did see a decline in births a bit during that COVID period. But again, we expect that to bounce back a bit as the population grows. And we did even see an increase interestingly, between 2015 and 2019 to the 2020 COVID period in terms of like the number of births that happened into this area. So more resilience here, but nevertheless, not the same number of births that we saw even as population is growing. And again, that's because of declining fertility rates. And because the population is so young here, the increase in deaths is expected to happen, but happen later on, right? It's the big jumps aren't happening until later into the 2040 period, whereas for other counties it happened even in 2015 to 2020, right? And life expectancy is very high in Washington County. People live on average much longer than they do than compared to other counties within Oregon and Oregon as a whole. And fertility had historically been much higher. The fertility rate had been much higher than the rest of Oregon, but that really aligned more in the 2000 period. We expect it to be more in line with what Oregon has. But the general trend is that what we're seeing is that outliers are tending to come down to the state average as fertility rates decline over time. And even here, this expectation of 1.5 births per woman is pretty high compared to what the US average is in their forecast period, as well, so. Even though you're seeing this decline in the fertility rate and less births, keep that in mind that this is still pretty optimistic, even in terms of the number of births that we're expecting compared to like what the US Census Bureau is expecting in terms of fertility decline. Bigger shifts here in terms of the population moving forward, less of a top-heavy population and more of a sustained, like high working age population. And this is due to the high migration that we have seen historically in Washington County and expect to see to some degree. Nevertheless, as people age in place, that aging process is going to affect the population as well. But in kind of unique shape that's happening on here. And Washington County has this unique aspect to it where a lot of the population growth is historically been contributed by the Asian Pacific Islander population. This is definitely like more unique than compared to the rest of the county as well. And there's different fertility and mortality patterns that we've accounted for in the Asian population and migration patterns as well that are going into these projections. As you can see, the white population increase has been really modest between 2000 and 2020. Asian population growth and Hispanic population growth to some degree are contributing disproportionately here in the county. So we'll do a review of the UGBs in the area. The general trend that you're going to see though is that our forecasts are lower this time again than what we saw last time, but nevertheless still increasing moving forward. So comparison between the city of Banks and Banks City rather and UGB area, so discrepancies there that we want to make sure to account for. And again, the UGBs very much differ in Washington County in this regard. Some the UGB in the city is very aligned and here is not. Modest increase of about 3.3%, so a smaller population here that hasn't really hit that like explosion threshold that we see in some of the population growth for locations, but a household income that's higher than the state average, an occupancy rate that's pretty high, an employment rate that is on par with the state with the young age population here as well. So we saw big increases between 2000 and 2010, 35% increase, that's definitely big in the UGB outliers, but then it tapered off, and this is where we have to be cautious. This is an instance where we saw big increases in, 2 time periods over 110 and 35%, but then a tapering off more recently in terms of the population forecast moving forward. And so again, we're expecting a bounce back in the population as we see more steady growth moving forward. This is sort of the comments that we saw from the Banks survey, is that we are seeing more consistent growth, but less of the large numbers of people moving in. And there are currently under construction waterline upgrades that are happening. And so you're going to see a little bit slower growth relative to what we saw in the past, only 5%. As we see some of those water lines take in and the more recent slow growth happen, but for that to pick up a bit as we move forward in the population increase. And this is a tone down, not just because of the fertility rates and the adjustment that we saw, but also because the 2020 census population came in and it was a bit lower than what we had forecasted for last time. So we have a downward adjustment in the forecast for a couple of different reasons here. So Banks has more of an impact in terms of the forecast moving forward. More downward adjustment than what we're seeing in other UGB areas. And again, so historically had been much higher than the region and the county, but by 2020 it was lower than the region and the county. We expect it to continue to be lower for some time, but then to bounce back to that higher growth rate that we observed before. Gaston. Area here, and the UGB, and the city, smaller UGB here. So again, for these, smaller 500-ish populations, a little bit harder to say what's going on. Consistent, modest growth in the population, less consistent growth in the housing that's going to affect our population moving forward. So even though we've seen consistent population growth, those fluctuations and the slow housing growth that have happened in the area are impacting our forecast, quite a bit. We're just not seeing housing keep up with the pace of growth. And so because of that, we expect growth to slow down until we can get, we expect some of that housing. We're not seeing any of the indicators that we were seeing for other locations in terms of like the population boom that happened with North Plains and Estacada. And because it's a smaller population here, we're not imbuing any of those like big, large growth intakes. We're expecting, more modest, stable growth, long-term growth over time. Again, that comparison here historically had been lower than the region and the county in terms of its growth, but we expect to see some of that to bounce back in the long term. As we had mentioned before, other places become more saturated in the market, become more expensive, and potential for Gaston to act then as a place where people are moving to instead. So North Plains, probably the biggest one want to talk about here. And so North Plains location where the UGB is the city boundary, essentially, where there isn't room left for the city to expand within the UGB, and why we're seeing a current, advocacy for expansion of the UGB boundary. Huge population growth here, 76% between the 2010 and 2020 census in the city boundaries, up to 3,441 in the population, and a big increase in the housing unit number as well. So we've seen housing units, it isn't always aligned that we see the housing unit increase match up with the population increase. More so here. This isn't to say that we didn't have historic underproduction as well, but at least the current housing increase is matching with the population. Occupancy rate of 2.8, again, higher than the state average there. Employment rate that is on par with the state average, if not a little bit higher, and a household income that's definitely higher than the state as well. Age 65 plus is a bit lower than the rest of of Oregon. Again, Oregon's at 18%. So we're seeing, a little bit older families that are in the area in terms of the population, right? And so there's that big growth that we saw, between 2010 and 2020. We don't also see big growth between 1990 and 2000, then become more modest, but then big growth again in that area. And again, housing production has for the most part kept on par within North Plains. So moving forward, what do our projections look like? But we have toned it down a bit since the last time that we saw these projections. There's a couple of reasons. One, the fertility forecast, again, people having less kids. We expect this to, this has happened across all of Oregon, all the US, and we expect this to impact North Plains as well. So even though we have these younger families, they're not having kids at the same rate as they were in the 90s. And even the early 2000s. And so that's impacting our adjustments here as well. We've also adjusted it to be more on par with what we've seen growth look like in the North Plains region in the past couple of years. Again, this is one where the growth has slowed down a bit within the city. And we expect that to bounce back. So we've adjusted these numbers upward a bit since November. The last time that we've made these forecasts to account for the fact that the number of housing units was above what we expected. We didn't expect it to be on par with the historic average, and it's between 2010 and 2020. But the degree to which we brought it down was a little bit more so than what you had indicated to us. And so thank you for contributing those surveys, Bill, to let us know that. Nevertheless, the downward adjustment that is applied to the rest of the county and the rest of Oregon as well is one that's impacting North Plains as well, and why you see these big differences between 2020 and the current set of forecasts for 2024. I do want to highlight though that again, similar to Estacada, North Plains and Estacada are big outliers in terms of population growth that we're expecting. So even though we did see this downward adjustment from the last time we made this forecast, I think that what we're forecasting now in light of the population dynamics that are happening in Oregon and the county as well is more reflective of the growth that we can expect in the area moving forward. It's also a growth that hasn't yet necessarily been hindered by the fact that the city is totally encompassed by the UGB. So I think we've talked about this a bit before on the justifications here on why we made these adjustments for North Plains. But if there's anything that you or anyone else on the call want to talk about here about these adjustments, happy to do so.
No, it was It was interesting seeing kind of the historical information about North Plains. And it sounds like you made some of the adjustments in your forecast, or at least the forecast moving forward. Forecast adjustments down anyway, at least
Yeah.
from prior forecasts. Had to do, I guess maybe I didn't understand this. Had to do with what growth you saw going back in the past for North Plains?
It's more, well, so some of it is the most recent, like the slower growth, like, so we use as our estimate space, like where we're jumping off. So between 2020 and 2022, we haven't seen the same kind of like huge jump in population.
And that was COVID.
Yeah.
And we have one builder in the city of North Plains
Totally.
building homes.
So
So what you're saying is the 20-year forecast is based on a 2-year anomaly.
no, not at all. So what we're saying is that we expect that to come back as well, and why you see still this jump of 25%. It's, if we look at the jump in percentage of growth between 2020 and 2023, it is like on par to be like 3%, right? And so we are not saying that is moving forward.
I think
We
there's some,
expect
the issue is that there's 2 years of misgrowth.
Yeah,
And so.
And
that
so-
just means shifts things down a little bit compared to
Yeah.
where they would have been. Because it
exactly.
doesn't- Like, we think the growth rate will return, but
Well-
not enough to make up those 2 years that we're kind of lost.
And we don't think it's going to, and to, be clear in like what our assumptions are, we don't think that it's going to jump back and take into account, oh, we missed 2 years of growth, so it's gonna be an explosion of growth. It's more just like the growth is like, is going to be more similar to what it was in the past. But that's why you see a jump between 2030 and 2040 compared to 2020 and 2030, where we're going up from 25.9 to 28.6 as we recover from that like COVID slowdown.
So notice
as
the
well.
gap between the bar just to the left of the vertical line and the bar just to the right is a little bit lower because of COVID, but the gap between that bar and the next green bar to the right is higher.
Right.
You might wanna check and see how many units were built between 2010 and 2014. And then compare that, cause I mean,
2010 to 2014.
yeah, you
nothing,
probably had
nothing.
nothing, and so you got all that growth in 6.
We got it since the end of voter approved annexations
Yeah.
in 2016.
Yeah.
So all of our growth has been since 2016. One thing that doesn't sound like has been factored in and looking at historical data versus growth moving forward, and part of why North Plains has been an explosively growing community. The land that we have in our current UGB that's nearly built out, we have about 300 more homes yet to be
Yeah.
built. That land was added to the North Plains urban growth boundary, almost 20 years ago.
Mm,
And it failed to be annexed into the city for years and years, actually until the year 2016. Because prior to 2016, cities in Oregon could put annexations, even in the city charter, cities had to put annexations up for public vote. And North Plains, and a few other ones were kind of the more pronounced cities in Oregon that repeatedly voted down annexations because sometimes, some places people don't like people living near them. They don't want more people living anywhere nearby, so they vote down annexations. In 2016, the legislature ended that. And so, cities now, when there is land capacity within an urban growth boundary, and if somebody wants to annex in for whatever new urbanized use, they can do that, and the city administratively deals with that situation. It no longer goes up from above. So there's a sea change in 2016 for not just North Plains. That really prior to 2016, looking at anything historically prior to that, and letting that be an ex post factor in forecasting forward, is really kind of makes the forecast suffer because it's just a different reality in terms of how a city could even legally grow.
Yep.
So I think that's part of why that question was asked.
no, totally, yeah. At the same time, I can't go back and pick a optimistic like 6-year time point of like growth and apply that like forward for any like UGB, right? Like, I think a lot of places would like to grow and like that road, and I have to imagine that other hurdles are gonna come and move forward as cities in UGB grows. Like, we just haven't seen and it seems less likely that it's going to occur as like we move forward and people are having less kids. Like a place have that high level of growth, like in the population moving forward that we had for the last set of
But
four.
North Plains' growth hasn't been population in place growth,
Mhm.
birth and death. It's been new households because of job growth nearby.
Yep, totally, but like the county is also receiving less migrants that we've seen in the past, and we're pushing that up, right? But it's
Yeah.
still not, it's like, and I understand that you can have inter-county moving as well, that people are coming, and absolutely people are coming from the metro UGB and coming to North Plains as well. And I totally understand that's happening, but certainly some people are coming in from outside of the county, contributing to growth in the area as well. And we're just not seeing the same level that we had seen in the past. And that is informative, you know, and I do like want to like stand by that, like North Plains is an outlier in growth, and this current trajectory that we have is, I think, second only. I have to go back to Estacada in terms of percent growth, but it's on par with Estacada and other cities that we observe. And I know you're trying to tell me that like we have a unique set of factors in North Plains that can lead to even higher than the outliers that are like going on. It's just for our baseline forecast, I'm picking, you know, outlier trajectories, I'm looking at outlier trajectories. And I'm like, we're already pretty high, you know, but I'm also taking into account these other population dynamics that I think are preventing the city from growing at the same way that we expected any city to grow, like from 4 years prior, you know? And like, yes, a lot of those people are moving in, it's internal growth, but that has cascading effects in terms of people having families like within the area as well, right? And if they're moving in and having smaller families than they were having before, moving in and it's 3 people instead of 4 people now, that's going to impact, right, the growth as well and what we're seeing. So it's even though it's a migrant-based growth, you know, it's a lot of people moving in. The fact that people are moving in with smaller families or having less kids when they get there is definitely going to have a cascading effect, right?
Well, that's just gonna make the growth yeah, to a certain extent, but that's not what we're experiencing in North Plains. The families that are moving in do tend to have higher than average, slightly higher household size. That just happens to be the demographic moving in. Largely people being almost overwhelmingly, people are being brought in for employment, 12, 15 minutes away. So I guess, you know, we'll communicate with you and, you know, kind of take a look at this and kind of look under the cover of some of the, for some of the variables in there, but, yeah, it's a challenge forecasting in a place like North Plains, so we would acknowledge that for sure.
Yeah, and if there is something explicitly that like we're, you know, because I think we're on the same page in terms of like what we're accounting for, and I want to put your concerns into the report and be like, these are the things that we're accounting for, these are the assumptions that are made. And this is why we've gotten this at number, here are the other reasons why growth could outpace this. You know, and so I want to put your comments in there, so this is helpful for being like, look, these are the assumptions that they made, it didn't account for this, you know, when we're talking about the numbers. You know, but I'm balancing a lot of patterns here, you know, in terms of like what's going on, so,
Sure,
yeah.
sure. Very good, thank you.
yeah. Let's see, where are we at time wise? Okay, we're supposed to be at the end of the meeting. If anyone has to go, I totally understand. We're at the last